Well, good evening once again. Tonight is one of those nights where you get to do a lot of finger exercise. We're going to go to a lot of different passages in the Bible. Before we get to the lesson, however, let me go ahead and tell you, you can turn to Romans chapter 2. In just a minute, I'll kind of join you there. But as you're turning there, and kind of as a segue into our lesson, I'll tell you a little bit about this flyer. It says, "Is Genesis history?" It's a program that deals with, as it says, two competing views, one compelling truth, and it's all about the book of Genesis, and is it history? And really what the question is Genesis true? Are the facts, are the things that you read in the scripture facts? Can they be verified? Why would anybody believe them? And this is going to be a movie. It is going to be Thursday, February 23rd. Here at the Parkside Theaters at 7 o'clock. It is one night, one time, one theater. So this is not one of those movies where check it out next week. There is no next week. Okay, it's this one night, one theater, Thursday, 23rd, 7 o'clock, Parkside Mall. Parkside Mall or Park Place Theaters. It is $15 a person. And the reason we mention it is because this is a movie that I think every Christian should go see, because it deals with the foundations of our faith, and it does so with some modern evidences and some of the modern complaints and some of the modern debate that takes on put into it. We have plenty of evidences, we have plenty of arguments, we have plenty of things that we can say in the realm of what we would call apologetics. But this is certainly going to be one of those things that you can add to it, and it's sort of a refreshing view that we can look at and take with us in our modern world to help us to be those in this world that have hope, because we have a firmness of faith. We have a rock upon which to stand. And I got to give this back to Chris, but I'm sure she'd be more than happy to let you kind of shoot a picture of that with your phone or whatever you need to do, copy it down. But I'd encourage you to go do that. But with that in mind, and with this event upcoming, I thought we would spend the next couple of Sunday evenings sort of talking about these things, talking about how this conversation has been approached in the past. Is Genesis history? Is Genesis history? Well, some look at Genesis and they kind of see it as a myth. Some look at Genesis and they see it as kind of a scientific treatise about how the world began. Some look at Genesis and they see it as kind of a historical or a retelling of historical events as they took place. What is our take on it? What do we think of Genesis? When we go to the first book of the Bible and we open it up and it says, "In the beginning, God." And we begin reading from there about the creation and the various days and the things that are created on each one of those days. What do we think about those things? Well, there are a range of possibilities if you just kind of take a survey of the landscape of all that people believe. There is the strict creationist view, which basically says it is what it is. There were 7 days. On each one of those 7 days, which a day means 24-hour period, God created these things. In the next 24-hour period, God created these things. And on you go until the 7th day, and God, of course, took his rest from creation, having placed man in a garden to allow him to tend that garden, be fruitful, and multiply. And there is the version that basically says that God created, and he uses days kind of representatively. And really, it's a period of what we might call epochs. The first day was a day of creation, and it was a basic day of creation. The fundamental building blocks of all of nature were founded. And then you go forward from there, and basically what you have, and there are subsets of this idea out there, but it's combining kind of the creationistic thought with evolutionary thought. And then, of course, you have the whole range of possibilities, or I should say ideas, that essentially say that, no, creation is really more of a tale that's designed to explain what we know is reality, and that is the evolutionary process. And of course, on and on you could go. But is Genesis history? It's not anything bold in this audience, but I would dare say that tonight we would all affirm that yes, Genesis is history, meaning that it is true. And the account of Genesis, taken at its face value, God speaking his word, says that Genesis, speaking of those days of creation, speaking of that time where man began, God spoke, and in 7 literal days, the world was formed. Now, the big question is, okay, now that we've made the statement, how do we back that up? What makes us think that that is true? And of course, you have to be able to answer that question, right? I mean, you can claim anything. I can claim that, every night before I, go to bed, my head blows up to the size of a blimp and then fills with all this knowledge. And, I'm just making it up here totally. I could create anything I want to. Every night before bed, my kids turn into dogs and I put them in kennels. That would be pretty cool, actually. No, but you can make up, you can claim anything. You can claim anything. There is a group in, Clearwater, with a nice big building, and they claim that, we are the byproducts of a blown up world and left behind degenerate material called Satan's, and we have to become clear, but guess what? You got to pay tens of thousands of dollars to do it. I don't know why people buy it, but that's what Scientology claims. Not enough to have a claim. You got to have more than a claim. So why is it that we think Genesis is true? And for that matter, why do we think that creation itself is true? Why do we think that the Bible itself is true? And that's a lot of questions, and we're not going to answer all of those in the 2 weeks that we have. But hopefully you'll go and see this movie, and if I had my guess, if it's one night and one showing, I'd get my tickets soon. You can go online. There's a website, isgenesishistory.com, and I would pre-order my tickets because I imagine it's gonna fill up. But what are the evidences? What are the things that we can point at? Well, I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is the reality of things. When I consider the notion of evolution, or even the notion of creation, or, evolution, I don't even know how to say it. Evolution combined, theistic evolution. Man, it just flew right out of my head. Theistic evolution. And I compare them to the notion of things being created. It is far more reasonable for me to think that we are created, that this world was created. Because if you look at the alternatives, all they really seem to offer are conjecture, theories, and a whole bunch of abounding nonsense. And I don't mean for that to sound really critical, but that's just simply the way it is. If you've ever seen the movie Expelled with Ben Stein, he corners this evolutionist into asking him, where did life begin? And he said, life begins on the backs of crystals. And then he goes on to talk about those crystals developing and all that. And Ben Stein says, you never answered my question. Where does life begin? And the guy says, well, I just told you. And he said, no, you told me about some crystals and life being on the back, but where did they come from? And where did the crystals come from? And the guy just kind of smirked and shook his head and laughed and went on to explain some more nonsense. And that's about all it is. And yet somehow we're supposed to believe that, rather than there's an intelligent being that somehow created our intelligent world where we live in our intelligence doing intelligent things. It makes a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? I think the fundamental idea of what is reality, if we just take our real world and we compare it to what each one of these different things teaches, it becomes abundantly clear, if we're honest with ourselves, that it just makes good common sense that we were created by an intelligent designer. Now, who that designer is the topic of a whole other discussion. But rest assured, things don't just pop into existence out of nothingness. And yet, in order to get evolution, that's what you have to have. And yet, the same scientists that will tell you that evolution is how we evolved and how it explains the beginning and the origin of things will also tell you that it is infinitesimally, let's go another way. It is impossible, statistically speaking, for something that is non-living to ever produce something that is living. So impossible is it numerically that it can very much be called or be said to be impossible. But I want to run through some of the arguments. Why do you believe in creation? Well, why do we believe in the Genesis story as history? Aside from the reality argument and just using good old common sense and knowing that our world doesn't function in the way that evolutionary thinkers or atheistic thinkers would tell us, where stuff just pops into existence out of nothingness, and then rocks can somehow produce, life, and steaks can somehow produce maggots, and so on and so forth. There are other things that we can say that bear saying. Number one, there is a universal sense of ought among humanity. In other words, all of us know that there is a rightness or wrongness to things. And most people are born with this innate ability to, on some level, determine the rightness and wrongness of things. And if you go over to the book of Romans, in Romans chapter 2, beginning at verse 14, Paul, speaking specifically of the Gentiles, says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. And even though they do not have the law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." Now, what Paul says there seems to be relatively convoluted, but what he basically says is this, that we have this sense of right and wrong, and it's written on our hearts. Well, by who? Well, Paul explains that, it's there by God, by virtue of creation. And we know the rightness and the wrongness of things. I mean, you can go to any nation in the world. You can go to any tribe, any clan, any cluster, any nationality, any place that people gather into groups. And what you are going to find is that they establish law. They establish amongst themselves a sense of what is right and what is wrong. And of course, our country is no different than the country that we came from when this country was founded. It wasn't any different. And while there are different systems of law, inherent in that notion of creating law itself is the idea that, some things are right and some things are wrong. Where does that come from? Well, according to the Bible, if we are indeed created beings, then it comes from God. How does science explain the conscience? Tell you, you want some interesting reading, just simply look it up. How does the evolutionist explain conscience? And you're going to find some of the silliest things you've ever heard in your life. Just look it up. Sense of right and wrong. It comes from God. There is no explanation. And that kind of takes us to this moral component of who we are, right? We realize that if morality is just a function of who you are and who I am, then really what we're talking about is not really a higher governing law. We're just simply talking about a preference. Even to the most extreme matters. So-and-so kills so-and-so. Now, do you think the family of that person can like that too much? No, I would hope not. But can you imagine living in a world where when confronting that situation and going to that person who committed that, what we know to be a crime, all they really simply had to say was, well, you know what? I'd like to do this. You may not like it, but I'd like to do this, and who are you to tell me any different? Because in reality, if we're not created beings, if somehow morality is just a function of our own making, then really it's just a matter of what we prefer, what you prefer. It'd be the same thing. Murder would be equivalent to whether or not you liked broccoli. Cheating on a spouse with someone else would be the equivalent of, do you like artichokes? It just comes down to personal preference. If it just developed over the course of time as we formed groups and clans and learned that certain things worked and didn't work, still, that's no more binding because it's a human device. And what human has the right, what human has the ability to create within us this law written on the heart? And of course, the answer is none. There must be a higher power. A higher law requires a higher power. If you go over to the book of Psalms, in Psalm 89 and verse 14, it says, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Now think about that for a minute. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Where does our sense of justice, where does our sense of rightness and wrongness come from? Well, it comes from God. And of course, He tells us all about that in His Word. He tells us all about the things that are right and the things that are wrong and how we're supposed to shape our lives in the shape of Him. Number two, there is a universal religious instinct. And again, I'm probably not telling you really anything new. These are arguments that have been around for a long time. Go to any, again, people across this globe. And what you'll find is that they have this innate desire to worship. Now, if you go to some remote tribe on some island that nobody's ever heard of, and if they did hear of it, they probably couldn't pronounce the name, you're going to find the people there worshiping something. Now, it might be the shrunken head of some animal that lives on their little island there in the middle of some ocean. But why worship at all? Why be compelled in any way, shape, or form to move our lives in a direction that basically says, there's got to be something more than me? And again, it is that sense that God has placed within us, that there indeed is a deity. There's a guy by the name of Pharaoh Jenkins. He once wrote this. He said, men in all the world and throughout all time not only believe in deity, but also engage in acts of worship and devotion. Have you ever heard somebody counter an atheist argument by saying, well, the atheist spends more time talking about God than most Christians do? Have you ever heard that? Well, that's basically this point. Even the atheists, by their vehement denials of God and their willingness to spend a large portion of their life devoted to trying to prove that there is no God, speaks to this point. You know, you would think that if they knew and they were assured, that they would just let the whole thing go. Those people over there, they just let them be on their own. They don't see reason. I don't see any reason to mess with them. Number three. There's a presence of beauty in this world, And there's a sublime nature in this world that science can't really explain. For instance, you can go and and I've mentioned this before, you can stand at the Grand Canyon and you can be in awe of the natural world around you. You can go to, Sequoia, and you can see those giant trees, and you can just stand there in utter dismay and kind of feeling that you're small, and you are. But where does that come from? Put it another way, why do great poets write poetry that are designed to move us and convince us of the beauty of this world or the beauty of this person? Why do people paint paintings? Why is it we have art at all? And then why do we go to university and study art appreciation and music appreciation? Why do any of that? Where does that come from? Where does that sublime nature and that presence of beauty? As a matter of fact, science has no explanation for what beauty is at all. Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Well, that's true to an extent, right? But we're not talking about what you think is beautiful. We're talking about the concept of beauty itself, kind of like the concept of love. How does science explain that? Where does it come from? See, in order to explain those types of things, we have to get into the complexity of what is the human being. And the deeper we dig into the complexity of the human being and the human mind and who we are as people, the more we begin to realize that science doesn't explain it all. Science can observe, and science can test and repeat and test and repeat and test and repeat. But in the end, it's just making observation. We can observe beauty, and we can know that it exists in this world, but when we talk about the origins of it, or where does that come from, why do we appreciate something, you can even get more complex than that. If you want to talk about photography, you can start talking about the rule of thirds and the golden hour and the Fibonacci sequence and all of those numerical things that people don't even realize or recognize, and yet it's that very thing that makes that photograph beautiful. Where did that all come from? It comes from God, because He designed the world to be appreciated by His creation that He placed here. Well, how do we know that? Well, we can go to the Scripture and we can read that. And look at God's discourse with Job. Now, God means it as a rebuke for Job, but He goes through and He tells him about all of these amazing creatures. He talks about dinosaurs. He talks about the great, ancient, what we know as dinosaurs of the sea, on the land. He talks about the sea itself. And even the psalmist, as you go through the Psalms and you consider them, you realize that God created this world to be a beautiful place. And it's only through understanding of that one simple fact that we can embrace the true beauty of what this world really is. Number 4. This is getting into even more familiar territory. Every effect has to have a cause, right? Something happens, something caused it to happen. Things just don't happen without some kind of cause. We know it to be true. We can look at the world around us, and this goes back to that reality argument. How do we explain certain things? How did these clothes get in the middle of the bathroom floor? Now, you would think at that point your kids would try to convince you that they just appeared there. There's no way that they left them there, right? There's no way that wet towel that was obviously used by somebody was used by them. Well, outside of that, bathroom enigma, that doesn't happen in the real world, does it? For every effect, for everything that is in this world, there has to be this cause. Now, this is sometimes what we call the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's been around since 1058 AD. People have been talking about this. People have recognized this for years. A guy by the name of Thomas Aquinas actually broke it into 5 different pieces. And he said, where things move, there has to be a mover. Where there is creation, there has to be a creator. And on he went, and he gives these 5 arguments that essentially boil down to different aspects of what we call the cosmological argument. For every effect, there has to be a cause. And of course, people often respond by saying, well, that's not really the case. Matter just simply is. And it has been for eternity. Well, it takes only a few seconds of thought to realize that's not true. Do we live in a world of infinite things? Brother Tim and I were talking the other day, and he brought up this problem in Mass. If you have a dog on one side of the room and a flea on the other side of the room, and the flea jumps toward the dog, and every time he jumps half the distance, how long will it take him to get to the dog? And of course, the answer is he'll never get to the dog, right? But the problem's actually worse than that. Because even with that scenario, it's just a made-up scenario. In anything in our world where we talk about the infinite, really we're talking about something that we cannot grasp. If you want to get into the real numbers of the situation, in a true infinite, there's no such thing as half. You take one step and you have infinity minus 1 equals infinity. If you take 1,000,000 steps toward any direction, what you have is this scenario where infinity minus 1,000,000 still equals an infinity. You cannot traverse an infinite. So what makes us think? Just looking at the world around us, at all the finite things, even our examples of the dog and the flea, we realize that it's just an example. Where do we truly ever discuss the infinite? Well, apple falls to the ground, seed goes into the ground, produces a tree. Yeah, but somehow that apple had to come from somewhere. That original seed had to be planted. There was that original tree. And it can't be infinite because, it's just very simply impossible in this finite world in which we live. Science fiction plays fast and loose with that idea, but it's just not reality. It reads like good fiction, but that's about all it is. Truth of the matter is for every effect in this world, there has to be a cause. Why? Because that's the way God made it. That's the way He made it. God spoke, and it was. Cause and effect. The evidence of intelligent design. Now, this is one that a few years ago we heard a lot about. Intelligent design. Where there is intelligence, where there is design, there has to be an intelligent designer. We've mapped the DNA code. We've examined around us the complexities of life to the microscopic level, to the reaches of outer space, though only touching really the hem of the garment. And we've seen the complexity of life at every hand, just down to the cellular level. We see this vast array of worlds that almost seem beyond our comprehension. And people, believe it or not, in our day and age still have the audacity to say that we do not live in a world that exhibits design. Now, how do you explain, animals, for instance, that will leave one place every year, fly to another place or migrate to another place every year with no directions, no one helping them, no navigation. Believe it or not, they make it without GPS. And they do it every year. And they have children who have children, who have children, who have children. And every single year, they fly from the exact place to the exact place. There's a place in Ohio where this happens. I got it. Hinckley. You know what comes back to Hinckley, Ohio every year? You know, HP? Yeah. Buzzards. Buzzards. That's their famous thing. Buzzards come back to Hinckley, Ohio every year. Like the sparrows go back to Capistrano every year. How does that happen? You can't tell me that happens by accident. Just simply look at your own reflection in a mirror. Behold your own eye and how it functions. You find the complexity of life and then try to tell yourself that you aren't a created being. The words are going to sound so silly coming out of your mouth. Just as they sound silly coming out of the mouth of those who, for some reason, don't accept it. Those are just a few of the things that we can say. That universal sense of ought, the religious instinct that we have, our appreciation of the beauty of the world around us, that every effect has to have a cause, and that there is design in this world. All tell us that the events that are described in Genesis, those days of creation, especially the creation of mankind, they're not just a story. They're fact. They're history. And when you read those words, you're not just reading something that is equivalent to the Bhagavad Gita or the Book of Mormon or the Pearl of Great Price or Dianetics or some other made-up piece of religious literature. You're reading the words of God. And each and every one of us, you are precious in His sight. And He's given you all of this so that you will come to Him, so that you can find your way to Him, groping in the darkness, finding the salvation that He offers. And that's where we'll end tonight. And that's the question that we have to ask. Is, have you come to Him? I mean, the Bible tells us that He is and that He created us and that all of these things are true. And we look in the world around us, and the arguments that I've given you are nothing more than what people have throughout the years observed. And you can get all technical and present all kinds of, highbrow words and all of that, but it simply comes down to it just makes good sense. Just like it makes good sense that if there is a creator, you find your way to Him. You embrace the salvation that He offers. And you live your life for Him. Are you here tonight and you need to take that step? Hear His word. Believe. Repent of your sins. Confess that Christ is the Son of the living God. Enter the waters of baptism so you can be washed clean. Knowing you'll rise to walk in newness of life. Maybe you have struggles. Maybe you need prayers. Whatever your need is, won't you come while we stand and sing?